Hello, I'm really pleased to be with you at the Connolly Centre in Belfast today. My name is Lauren Arrington. I'm Head of English at Maynooth University, where I'm also Head of Department. And today I'm going to be talking with you about Constance Markievicz, who I wrote a biography of a couple of years ago, and a double biography of Constance and her husband Casimir, putting them in their social and cultural context and rethinking their lives through close scrutiny of archival materials. And as we'll talk about today, that significantly changes the way that we think about Markievicz's political development. So for nearly a century, our understanding of Markievicz has been inflected by gendered stereotypes that were established by some of the first historians of the Easter Rising and by Markievicz's first biographers. We'll talk about Markievicz's specific role in the Easter Rising later in this lecture, but for now, it's important to know that she was the only woman sentenced to death because of her actions in 1916. And her death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment at the court, as the court records show, solely on account of her sex. So Markievicz expected a death sentence. From her cell in Kilmainham jail, she heard the executions of her friends, including her close friend and political mentor, James Connolly. However, before her trial by court-martial, Prime Minister Asquith told General Maxwell, who was in charge of dealing with the insurrection, that, quote, no sentence of death on any woman, including Countess Markievicz, should be confirmed and carried out without reference to the Field Marshal Commanding-in-Chief himself. So all of the leaders in the Rising were charged with taking part in an armed rebellion and in the waging of war against His Majesty the King, which was, quote, calculated to be prejudicial to the defense of the realm and being done with the intention and for the purpose of assisting the enemy. The Defence of the Realm Act, or DORA, as it was known, was an act of parliament brought about in the context of the First World War. When this charge was read out against her in court, Markievicz asked, do you mean the Germans? I didn't help them. I couldn't. The officers were so surprised by her candor that they agreed her plea could be listed as not guilty, even though she didn't dispute her role in the Rising. Markievicz, along with Connolly, McDermott, and Michael Mallon, faced the additional charge of attempting, quote, to cause disaffection among the civilian population. And Markievicz was the only person to be convicted of this offense of all of the leaders of the Rising. When charged with it, she pled guilty. She said, I always talk sedition. And as we'll see, this always was an exaggeration. There are different accounts of what happened at Markievicz's trial, and even the most reliable of these accounts described her behavior in a way that drew attention to her gender in order to discredit her. One of the most famous and also the least reliable accounts of her trials is by W.E. Wiley, who was a King's Counsel, a barrister, and a member of the Territorial Army who served in the Trinity College Dublin Officer Training Corps that was mobilized to suppress the Rising. Wiley was appointed Assistant Provost Marshal during the Rising, and he assisted with administering the surrender and with guarding and sorting the prisoners after. He also acted as prosecutor during the courts-martial. Wiley's attitude towards female prisoners was misogynistic, to say the least. He referred to them as the girls. He wrote, for example, I chased them all home except the four, and here he means Madeline French-Mullen, Kathleen Lynn, Helena Maloney, and Winifred Carney, and often wondered what happened to them afterwards, or did any of them remember the gallant second lieutenant. The influential historian of Ireland, Loan O'Brien, unquestionably quoted Wiley's account of Markievicz's court-martial. I'm quoting O'Brien here. He said, military officials quite expected that Markievicz would make a scene and throw things at the judge and counsel. In fact, said Wiley, I saw the general, meaning Maxwell, getting out his revolver and putting it on the table beside him. But he needn't have troubled, for she curled up completely. I'm only a woman, she cried, and you cannot shoot a woman. You must not shoot a woman. She never stopped moaning the whole time she was in the courtroom. I think we all felt slightly disgusted, Wiley declared. She had been preaching to a lot of silly boys, death and glory, die for your country, etc. Wiley's misogyny and O'Brien's uncritical repetition of the account reflects the resentment that was widespread among British officials and representatives of the Crown in Ireland. In an inquiry into the rising that was held at the end of May 1916, the head of the Dublin Metropolitan Police remarked that it was a serious state of affairs to have the peace of the city endangered by a gang of roughs with rifles and bayonets at large at that time of night, with a female like the Countess Markievicz in charge. Similarly, even before the court-martial, General Maxwell expressed his belief that Markievicz was blood guilty and dangerous, a woman who's forfeited the privileges of her sex. The Viceroy Lord French wrote to Maxwell, I agree with you. She ought to be shot. Now, rumors about Markievicz's cowardly behavior circulated among the Dublin elite. The daughter of the provost of Trinity College, Elsie Mahaffey, repeated it in her diary. She utterly broke down, cried and sobbed and tried to incite pity. It was a terrible scene, the gaunt wreck of a once lovely lady. Mahaffey's diary entry is telling because it gets to the crux of the matter, the sense that Markievicz had betrayed her social class. In influential popular and historical accounts, Markievicz's gender and social class are taken together in order to create an image of her as absurd, hysterical, and unserious. So here you see Sean O'Phelan, who you've been looking at for a little while, and you might guess what his attitude toward Markievicz was. He published the first biography of her in 1934, where he wrote, in her there lacked a fundamental earnestness. She was superficial about the most serious things. Worst of all, she was, it is clear, sexually cold. Now, O'Phelan, it should be said, published this biography of Markievicz in the context of a series of biographies that he wrote purely for profit. And so that certainly motivated some of the sensationalism behind his account, but it doesn't change the politics behind his account and the way that his biography reflects the popular understanding of Markievicz in the 30s among particular literati. In Sean O'Phelan's fictional autobiography, Drums Under the Window, she's depicted as being obsessed with violence. Describing the presentation of the starry plough, the flag of the citizen army, O'Casey writes, all pressed back to have a good look at it, and a murmur of reverent approval gave the flag a grave salute. All except the Countess, who returned the oiling of her automatic with the remark that the flag bears no Republican message to anyone. So O'Casey here is very deliberately severing Markievicz from the tradition of the citizen army, a tradition that O'Casey believes was betrayed by the decision of to join the ICA to the other revolutionary groups at the Rising, and he sees her as being responsible in a way for that change in his view in politics. Of course, Markievicz sees the ICA's involvement as absolutely central to what the Rising is about, and we can talk about that in a couple of minutes. So we can consider together the factors leading to Markievicz's radicalization as a way of understanding the resentments that are articulated in the contemporaries and we can consider together the factors leading to Markievicz's radicalization as a way of understanding the resentments that were articulated in contemporaneous and posthumous depictions of her role in the Easter Rising, which we've seen here, O'Casey and O'Phelan as exemplars. I think it's useful to think about these influences in terms of four spheres that sometimes overlapped: her life as an aristocrat, as an artist, as a socialist, and as a revolutionary. So let's think about Markievicz's early life to begin with. She was born in London. She grew up for the most part at Lissadell House in County Sligo. The daughter of Henry and Georgina Gore Booth. She has an older brother, Jocelyn, and two younger sisters, Eva and Mabel. She's closest to Eva, and they have significant political affinities when it comes to philanthropy in their early lives, and then, of course, the suffrage movement as they become teenagers and young adults. Henry was frequently away from the family estate. He went on fabulous Arctic expeditions on his own ship and would come back and host these really elaborate dinner parties in the harbor. Guests would troop down from the estate and have dinner on board. It's really, really fantastic. It's cinematic in a way, the accounts of Henry's life. So Henry is off doing these very aristocratic things while Georgina is home, and she's energetically devoted to philanthropic work for Lissadell's tenants. So this is very much in the tradition of the 19th century landed class. When Constance is very young, Georgina established a school of needlework for the women of Lissadell, where she taught crochet, embroidery, and darning. And she arranged for opportunities for the women on the estate to sell their work, which provided them with an independent income. So on one hand, you can think of this in terms of 19th century patronage. On another hand, you can think about this in terms of early feminism, which is, of course, reliant on patronage, but that is focused on helping the women of Lissadell become independent within the limited means. Now, while Markievicz is growing up, legislative reforms were giving wealthy women more power in the public sphere. The Local Government Act of 1894 permitted women who met specific property qualifications to serve as poor law guardians. And in Ireland, the Dublin Women's Suffrage Association proclaimed that this act was a landmark in the women's movement because it gave women representation in government, albeit local government. Constance and her sister Eva, who later become an important leader in the women's suffrage movement in Britain, were politicized by pro-suffrage discourse in Ireland, which was overwhelmingly driven by upper class women. In 1898, when Constance was 28 years old, still unmarried and living on the Lissadell estate, which is a cause of great concern to her family, she and Eva formed a Sligo branch of the Irish Women's Suffrage and Local Government Association. At a public meeting that the Gore Booth sisters organized, Markievicz made her first recorded political speech, which was reported in the local newspaper. She said she intended to dispel the wild gossip that was circulating about the suffrage movement. And here you see part of that quote, that it will cause women to ape the other sex, to adopt their clothes, copy their manners and peculiarities, that it will cause women to neglect their homes and duties, and worst of all, prevent the majority marrying. Of course, this may be true. Pigs might fly, as the old prophecy says, but they are not likely birds. And this great sense of humor that comes through in her speech, really knowing her audience, is evident from the way that the newspaper records the roaring laughter from the audience at this speech. And for her to say this, at the age of 28 and as an accomplished horsewoman, you see here besting one of the other great riders in the county and one of the local hunting meets, probably underscored rather than undermined this wild gossip about suffrage because of the way that she is breaking all of these gender norms and threatening these boundaries that she's jesting about. But nonetheless, she deftly carried her audience through political turns of argument. She said, in Ireland, our country had been at the forefront of the fight for liberty, but was now, quote, so far behind England in the struggle to emancipate half its population. So here she's trying to kind of gee up a nationalist sentiment in order to get some momentum behind the suffrage movement. She asks rhetorically, if women are so incompetent, why have there never been an outcry against our woman queen? She reminded her audience that it had been a generation since John Stuart Mill and Benjamin Disraeli had supported suffrage in the British Parliament. She said, and here, kind of moving from this humor that opens her speech into a pathos of emotion, she says, many of our ablest teachers are gone. They saw the promised land from the mountaintop, then died like Moses in the wilderness, having had their glimpse of the land of Canaan, dim and faint in the distance. Now, the success of this first suffrage meeting the Gore-Booth sisters organized outweighed the throngs of local men who turned out to heckle the sisters. In January, Constance spoke again about suffrage, this time to the Sligo branch of the Women's Temperance Union. She is not a temperate woman, but nonetheless, she was one of their featured speakers when she professed her full support of abstention as, quote, a woman who realized her position in the world. So you can see the way very early on in her speeches, she's learning to wear different faces for different audiences. And this is a skill that she carries right through the revolutionary period. She was willing to do what was necessary politically in order to bring people on board behind the movement that she's advocating. So through these vignettes, we can see Constance Gore-Booth's aristocratic upbringing shaping her as a political actor in key ways. It introduced her at a very high level to the women's suffrage campaign in Ireland. It provided a foundation for philanthropy, which we'll see evolved into a radical position on wealth and property later on in her life. And it provided a platform which trained her in public speaking and gave her a ready audience and publicity. Her aristocratic background makes her an influential figure from the start. And this is where some of the resentment comes in, not only among the historians and biographers that we began this talk with, but also among some of her women comrades in the movement. But first, before we get there to the revolution, think about Markievicz as an artist. She is here on the left in her studio in Paris. You can see she's living a far from abstemious life after her speech to the Temperance Union. You've got a candle propped in a wine bottle, all kinds of fabulous art and wall hangings on the walls. She's wearing a smock with her hair disheveled. This is really captures what her life was like in Paris. So the Bohemian culture, for which turn of the century Paris was famous, relied on the bourgeoisie, both in terms of shaping an aesthetic other, so something to rebel against, and as a material means for making this life possible, because it is middle class and wealthy women who are able to be supported by independent incomes and kind of indulge in this kind of lifestyle. Bohemians define themselves in opposition to middle-class values. And here we can see Markievicz finding herself in a movement that expresses the rebellion that we see early on, all through her teenage years, which is recorded in her diary. In the late 19th century, the growing independence of middle and upper class women made them an important market for Parisian academies of art. Rudolf Julien's academy, where Constance Gore-Booth studied, was open to men and to women, but women paid higher tuition fees and they were taught in separate studios to the men. And this was Julien's concession to middle-class families who were concerned about the mixing of classes as much as they were concerned about the mixing of sexes in Paris studios. They wanted to be sure, parents wanted to be sure that if they sent their daughters to Paris, they would be among like-minded, cultured, and edifying influences. And you can see that surely worked out from the photograph on the screen. Now, it was impossible to legislate Paris nightlife. And the night is how Constance met Casimir Markievicz, a Polish painter who taught in one of Julian's men's studios. And here they're dressed up for a fancy dress ball that happened, regular occurrences on the culture of the studios. So she's on the left, you can see wearing this fabulous fringe, bearing her arms, wearing what looks like possibly a kind of Egyptian style headdress, or possibly a wig. It's hard to tell from the resolution of the photo, which is taken from one of her scrapbooks that's in Prony. So very local to you at the Connolly Museum. And Casimir's on the right, wearing tights and some kind of Greco-Elizabethan fantastic outfits with these beads. And in the middle is Casimir's a friend, a Polishman who is also in Paris studying art, and he claims later to have introduced them at a dance. So it all started here. So the Markieviczes, like the Gore Booths, are upper-class landowners who settled in disputed territory. Now, their lands were in the Western Ukraine, which was nominally Poland, but also considered to be part of Russia. So you can see a parallel here in terms of the settling of the ascendancy class in Ireland and the settling of the Polish landed class in Ukraine, this disputed part of Ukraine, which is in this liminal space between Russia and Poland. Between these two empires, the Polish and the Russian, the landed elite in Eastern Galicia is courted by Russia for political support. So you can see kind of parallel in terms of affinities between the Anglo-Irish ascendancy and the British government and the landed class in Poland and Imperial Russian politics. Polish settlers in Ukraine had a Russian imperial allegiance while they maintained a Polish cultural identity. Here you can see Constance dressed in traditional Polish clothing, posed for a picture that's very similar to pictures she posed for to support things like cooperative farming, which we saw earlier for an Eva dressed as dairymaids, and Irish textiles like linens and wools. So here again, this is from the family scrapbook when she was visiting the Markieviczes on their estate. Well, Casimir's Polish identity was not exactly, but was quite similar to the cultural position of the Anglo-Irish in the early 20th century. So this kind of hybridity of identity is something that Constance and Casimir find affinity and build their relationship on in the early years. They're married despite early objections from her family, and they moved to Dublin in 1903. Along with Casimir's son, Stanislaus, who Constance adopts fully as her stepson. And Stanislaus later writes some really moving tributes to Constance, which reinforce the generosity with which she embraced him as a son. When they returned to Ireland, they're very much received as artists in Dublin. The painter and mystic George Russell, also known to you as A.E., wrote to his fellow painter Sarah Purser, "The Gore Booth girl who's married to the Polish count with the unspellable name is going to settle near Dublin about summertime. As they're both clever, it will help to create an art atmosphere. We might get the materials for a revolt, a new Irish art club. I feel some desperate schism or earthquaking revolution is required to wake up Dublin in art matters." Russell is perhaps unprepared for exactly how earthquaking Constance Markievicz's presence is going to be in Ireland. The turn of the century, of course, brings with it a tide of cultural nationalist movements that aim to unite Irish people in a sense of national identity that bridges party political divides and also sidesteps different visions of how Ireland should be defined in relation to Britain. So it's a kind of a third space really for talking about this relationship. And a lot of this culture is centered on the Irish elite, including Dublin Castle, where the Viceroy hosts balls where guests are encouraged wear clothes made of Irish textiles or designed with Irish motifs like the shamrock. And Constance and Casimir, just as they dressed up in Paris, dress enthusiastically for these balls at Dublin Castle when they first arrive. But later, Markievicz comes to think of these performances of national identity as superficial. But when she first arrives in Dublin, she's very much part of this performative culture. For about 5 years, the Markieviczes move in multiple spheres of society. They move in unionist upper class social life of Dublin Castle, and they move in more moderate home ruler, and then also a radical separatist space where cultural spaces like the Abbey Theatre are being used as battlegrounds for these different political visions. So just as Markievicz early on is able to speak in a different way to different audiences in Sligo about suffrage, she's learning to speak to different types of political identity in Dublin through her movement in these cultural spheres. Now, over this half decade, their circle of associates, both Constance and Casimir's, becomes more radical. Constance joins the Daughters of Ireland, and she begins writing columns for the newspaper Bon na hÉireann, in which she begins to make a case for the skills that women bring to national organization. So this bringing together of a feminist with a nationalist political identity. Now, Constance and Casimir are both involved in the Dublin theatre scene. You can see here Casimir's most successful play, The Memory of the Dead, which was staged at the Abbey Theatre and in 1910, and is based on the historical event of 1798, which was, of course, established an important centenary commemoration led by important figures like Maud Gonne. And Constance is kind of just misses out on the celebration of that centenary in 1898, but the legacy of the centenary is very important to the way that nationalism is being expressed in the years that follow. Now, Casimir's play brings together Ireland's political ambitions for independence and the idea of women's suffrage. More to the point, it makes very prominent the importance of gender equality within the nationalist movement. And well, we can ascertain from what we know of Casimir that he was a feminist, as it would be defined in his own time. There is also probably a very strong influence of Constance in the shaping of this play, although she's not officially credited, because she had lots of involvement in amateur theatricals at Lissadell House growing up, and as we know, a keen sense already of dramatic dialogue. Constance plays the character of Nora, who dresses in men's clothing in order to serve as a guide to Donegal, where the Irish are to rendezvous with the French Navy. And Nora declares, "If there are men in Ireland ready to die for their country, there are just as many women." So it's very plain kind of agit-prop dialogue in that play. Now, the Daughters of Ireland are divided over the extent to which women should be enablers or actors in the national movement. The newspaper Bon na hÉireann tended to emphasize what women did to help men rather than to strike out on their own. And this frustrated Constance, and she looked for ways to teach young girls how to embrace a more radical idea of their role in society. She works with Bulmer Hobson to organize a youth scouting movement, the Fianna Éireann, and you can see her here in the middle of the second row. So there's a row of boys seated, and she's right there in the middle in a light-colored outfit, probably white dress. So the Fianna Éireann are formulated along the style of the Boy Scouts in Britain. And in Britain, the scouting movement is used to train children in skills they needed to be soldiers in the Imperial Army. But Markievicz insisted that girls should be included in the Irish Nationalist Scouts, the Fianna. And you can see a few girls here in this photo outside the Mansion House in Dublin, particularly in the second row, and then some older girls in the kind of next row down from the back. While the Fianna boys and their parents accepted Markievicz, who's very much seen as a maternal figure, against kind of what we understand of her legacy. That's how kind of parents see her as kind of a safe pair of hands because she's a woman. They didn't accept girls so readily in their ranks. So disputes over the equality of boys and girls in the Scouts led to Markievicz's marginalization in the Fianna. And this gathering is from 1913, and you can see that there is a small proportion of girls, but not nearly the equality of representation that Markievicz was advocating for. She believed that women should participate fully in the national movement, and they should not be restricted in any way because of their sex. So she's involved in Cumann na mBan, the League of Irish Women, but she gravitates toward the Irish Citizen Army because of its socialist politics, which includes, of course, equality of the sexes. And it's as a member of the ICA that she participates in the Easter Rising. I spend more time on Markievicz's involvement in Cumann na mBan and her debates and her activism in that organization in the biography. But today, I think it's important to stress the ICA because that's very much the way that Markievicz identified at the time of the Rising, and of course reflects Connolly's influence on her. So here you can see her posed in her ICA uniform in postcards that are produced later in the Revolution, I think around 1921, in order to raise money for Irish prisoners. And it's significant that that long after the Rising, she's still dressing in her ICA uniform. That's how she wants to be memorialized in a way. So after the Easter Rising, she identifies principally as a lieutenant of the ICA and then as a volunteer of the Irish Civil War of 1922. So let's talk a little bit about the foundation of the ICA and think about what socialism meant for Markievicz. In the summer of 1913, Dublin erupted in a violent clash between unionized workers and the city's employers. So factory owners, the owners of transportation and what we now think of as logistic companies, so kind of freight, goods hauling, that sort of thing. William Martin Murphy, whose names I'm sure will be familiar with you, not least because of Yeats's poem To a Wealthy Man in September 1913, organized a meeting of 300 employers who were afraid that a reduction in the 17-hour workday would severely affect their profits. So that was the standard. I think it's important to put in real terms what the ICA is organizing against. So their solution to prevent this loss, the owner's solution, was to deny entry to work for any employees who are members of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, which represented over 10,000 workers in the city. So you think about that, 10,000 workers and a 17-hour workday, kind of the amount of capital that they're producing. And you can understand when you put it in those terms, the fear really among the employers of what the reduction in the workday will mean for them in real terms. But you can also think about in humanitarian terms what life is like for the working class in Dublin. So this industrial dispute became a surrogate battleground for Ireland's relationship to empire, since the employers rely on export of their goods to Britain. So Ireland's poverty rate is on par with some of the poorest parts of empire. It's equal to the poverty rate in Calcutta. Irish wages are also steadily falling behind inflation and the rise of wages in Britain. So at a meeting of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union on the 29th of August in 1913, James Connolly declared that he did not recognize the authority of the British government in Ireland and refused to be bound by it. So Connolly is immediately arrested by the Dublin Metropolitan Police, who consistently represent capitalist British imperialist interests in Dublin. The leader of the ITGW, Jim Larkin, announced that he would speak on Sackville, which is now O'Connell Street, the following Sunday. So that weekend, there are riots across Dublin as tensions run high in anticipation of Larkin's speech. Protesters against Connolly's arrest throw stones and bottles at police, who retaliate violently. On Sunday, Larkin sneaks into the Imperial Hotel, which is owned by William Martin Murphy, and he delivers a speech from the balcony. A window is broken in Murphy's department store, Cleary's, which is right across the street, and the police draw their batons and charge the crowd, attacking even the most peaceful protesters. Casimir Markievicz, who is there, is prompted to think of events in Russia from 1905, and he refers to this event as Bloody Sunday in a letter he writes to the Irish Times. So this christens what becomes known as Ireland's first Bloody Sunday and makes that connection with Russian politics. Now, Larkin is arrested and he's held in jail until the middle of November, so for about 6 weeks. Markievicz and Connolly organize a rally to greet Larkin on his release, which she declares the proudest moment of my life, to be associated with the workers of Dublin when their great and noble leader has been released. Now, Connolly uses this occasion to lay the foundation for a new militant campaign. Referring to the organization of the Unionist Ulster Volunteers, Connolly says, "Why should we not drill men in Dublin as well as in Ulster? I say nothing about arms at present. When we want them, we know where to find them." Connolly says the workers are in a state of war, and he tells the crowd that when they collect their strike pay from the union, they should also record their address so they can be informed, quote, when and where you have to attend for training. So this implicitly militarizes the ITGW and provides the basis for the citizen army. So the citizen army begins organizing hundreds strong marches through Dublin in order to show their resolve. There are numerous clashes with the police, and as a result, the ICA establishes a formal structure that included an army council on which Markievicz serves as vice chair. So Markievicz and Connolly work together to draw up a constitution for the ICA that borrows from Wolfe Tone's 18th century republicanism and James Fenton Lawler's 19th century writings about national ownership. Lawler wrote in his essay, The Rights of Ireland, "The entire ownership of Ireland, moral and material, up to the sun and down to the center, is vested of right in the people of Ireland, that they, and none but they, are the landowners and the lawmakers of this island, that the entire soil of a country belongs of right to the entire people of that country, and is the rightful property, not of any one class, but of the nature at large." So Lawler's writing shapes Marx and Engels' writing about Ireland, and in turn, Mark shapes Connolly's writing about socialism, imperialism, and nationalism. After Connolly's execution at Easter 1916, Markievicz very much sees herself as responsible for representing and for bringing about Connolly's vision of a socialist republic, which, when you think about this lineage of ideas, is both rooted in Irish nationalism and international socialism. It transforms. And Markievicz, understanding that lineage or that genealogy of ideas, helps explain how the idea of the sovereignty of Ireland does not exist in opposition to, but in tandem with, an international socialist outlook. And that's how Markievicz understands Irish independence. So let's think again about the ICA. So the three influences I've outlined in this lecture, feminism, nationalism, and socialism, underpin Markievicz's actions as a revolutionary. And those actions begin in the ICA's organization in opposition to Irish conscription in the First World War. Here you can see the ICA gathered in ranks outside Liberty Hall is kind of very iconic and famous picture of declaring opposition to empire and a commitment to national sovereignty. And this photo anticipates the way that we see the mobilization at the time of the Rising. So Markievicz in Easter 1916 and after. On Good Friday, 1916, James Connolly issued the mobilization orders that were to go into effect the moment that the rebellion began. So Good Friday, it's important to pause to remember, is important not only because of its symbolism in the Christian tradition, which is where the emphasis tends to lie in the mythology of Easter 1916, but also because of its practical significance. It's a public holiday, so members of the ICA can assemble freely at Liberty Hall. They're not absent from work, they're not losing wages in order to neglect their jobs in order to turn out. So that weekend, Easter weekend, is spent preparing rations and manufacturing ammunition at Liberty Hall. We'll get to this photo in a moment, but just kind of so that it's in the back of mind. Most of Saturday is spent preparing homemade bombs, which are later described as one participant as being oil cans through the neck of which a galvanized iron tube went down. The fuse passed through this. It was blue and red. You lit the blue end, and when it burned the red, you threw it. These munitions are rudimentary, but they turn out to be very important when the transportation of rifles and ammunition that was brought over from Germany by Erskine Childers is scuttled in Cork Harbor. So these homemade munitions become what the revolutionaries rely on. And when you understand the kind of rudimentary construction of them, you can understand the casualties that are often suffered by revolutionaries themselves in trying to carry out these tactical acts during the Rising. And you can see some of those close accounts of injury and Lucy McDermott's book about the women of the Easter Rising, what they said and did. So another wrench, of course, is famously thrown in the works when Owen McNeill issues his countermanding order in the Sunday Independent, calling off the movements of the Irish Volunteers. So to get rid of their pent-up energy, having expected to be mobilized and then be told to stay put, the ICA goes on a route march on the Sunday, where they stop at significant sites. They go down from Liberty Hall, they go down College Green, down the side of Stephen's Green by the College of Surgeons, where the ICA will soon occupy, past Dublin Castle and Jacob's Biscuit Factory, and back to Liberty Hall. So this route march, you can see, although they did not know it at the time, it's documented in the Irish Worker, the route that they took. It anticipates the occupation of sites that will happen the next day. Rosie Hackett recalled in her witness statement to the Bureau of Military History, as we came to each of these places that were taken afterwards, the bugle sounded. We did not know it at the time, but as each place was taken afterwards, we thoroughly understood what the route march was for. So here's the College of Surgeons, where Markievicz will ultimately give the surrender. Back at Liberty Hall, though, still on the weekend before Easter Monday, having kind of exercised themselves with this route march, they drink tea, they have a party, they have a performance from the Workers' Orchestra. The men spend the night at the hall while the women, including Markievicz, Rosie Hackett, and Kathleen Lynn, stay at the home of Jenny Wise Power, the president of Cumann. The next morning on Easter Monday, the women are whisked back to Liberty Hall, where the militia is already assembling. About 300 people are members of the ICA, and about 220 fight in Easter week. So there's a very high proportional turnout, especially in comparison to the Irish Volunteers. At 11:45 in the morning, the bugle sounds and the order to fall in is issued. A column of about 40 ICA set off from Liberty Hall to College Green under the leadership of Sean Connolly. Markievicz and Lynn follow by car, where they arrive just in time to see Connolly shoot an unarmed Dublin Metropolitan Police constable who's on duty at the castle gate. Markievicz later describes the scene that followed as one of wild excitement. Nobody know exactly what to do, but rather than charge into Dublin Castle, James Connolly orders the occupation of City Hall next door and the premises of the Daily Express newspaper across the road. And of course, we know this is a fatal error. Kathleen Lynn stays behind to give medical support, and Markievicz drives on to Stephen's Green. I just want to pause there to reinforce the idea that Sean Connolly, who is often recognized as effectively a martyr, the first person shot and killed in the Rising, had before he died shot an unarmed policeman. And this act of shooting a policeman, of course, is what haunts Markievicz. It's an act that's used to discredit her by some of her first biographers and also to cast aspersions on her in popular memory. But putting her act later at the Green in context of what has already happened at Dublin Castle shows that hers was not an exceptional act. Also, we have to think about that shooting of the policeman in context of police violence against workers and the Dublin lockout, and the way that the Dublin Metropolitan Police had aligned itself with capital and empire from 1913 onwards. So the ethics of that shooting are a lot more complex than is usually appreciated. So at Stephen's Green, Markievicz meets up with Michael Mallon, who had led a column of ICA, Cumann na mBan, and Fianna from Liberty Hall. The militia evicted the civilians from the park and commandeered civilian vehicles to form barricades in the street. While most histories of the Rising describe the activities of Cumann na mBan as being auxiliary or supportive rather than armed, Markievicz later remembered some of the girls had revolvers, and with these they sallied forth and held up bread vans. Through Monday afternoon, Markievicz and Mallon concentrated on keeping up morale, patrolling the Green and monitoring their troops' preparations. They heard a rumor that the College of Surgeons, which you see here, contained an armory that belonged to Trinity's Officer Training Corps. So Markievicz led a group to secure the college, and this is among the many mistakes she made, a move of significant foresight. She returns to the Green, where she's in charge of the western perimeter, and she oversees the commandeering of passing traffic. Now, civilians are incredulous. Many refuse to divert their journey or give up their vehicles. They don't understand the performance that they're seeing. One man who was stopped in his car reported to the Irish Times soon after the Rising that Countess Markievicz, who was attired in male uniform and armed with an automatic pistol, was profuse in her apologies to the prisoners, that's the civilians who were detained. She explained that their detention had to be enforced for the cause of the Irish Republic. It all sounds quite sensible and measured in that newspaper report, which is not very often quoted. So this polite communication is at odds with the depictions of Markievicz's behavior that we see in other accounts, many of them compiled long after the Rising occurred. By the afternoon of the first day, 6 policemen had been shot, 2 fatally. At least 2 of these policemen were unarmed. Sean Connolly had killed the constable at Dublin Castle, a fact which I've said is usually disregarded. Now, over 100 years after the Rising, it's still Markievicz's shooting of the policeman that fascinates the public. But Markievicz did shoot the policeman at Stephen's Green. He didn't die at the scene, which may explain her confusion over whether or not later she had killed an unarmed man. She says in one account, I winged him, I didn't kill him, which is true. He was shot in the side and he later died in hospital of his injuries after she is already given the surrender. So she's no awareness really of the repercussions of that action when she's asked about it. At dawn on the Tuesday, British troops who had during the night moved into the tall buildings surrounding the green opened fire on the volunteers below. It's carnage. They had to evacuate, and over the next several hours, they move into the College of Surgeons, which becomes their fortress. Days wear on, and they all think they're going to die there. They think they'll be starved, if not invaded. The delivery of supplies by Commandant has been disrupted by the movement of British troops over the preceding hours. They're only left with some dry oats. So they're basically eating small rations of porridge. And it's here in this kind of existential crisis, really, of wanting to declare her camaraderie with her fellow volunteers and also her awareness of a pending death that Constance converts to Catholicism. On Sunday morning, news comes that Pierce and Connolly have signed the surrender. Pierce's nurse, Elizabeth O'Farrell, arrived at the College of Surgeons in the company of Major de Courcy Wheeler of the British Army. Markievicz is the first person at the college to see the order, and O'Farrell remembered that she was, quote, very much surprised to see it. Markievicz wakes up Malin. He's been resting upstairs, and they accept the instructions. Rosie Hackett remembered seeing Markievicz sitting on the stairs with her head in her hands. She was very worried, but did not say anything. I just passed in as usual, and she only looked at me, but I knew that there was something wrong. Mr. Malin went round, shaking hands with all of us. I was coming down the stairs when I met him. He took my hand and did not speak. He was terribly pale. Malin and Markievicz insisted, despite protests from their comrades in the ICA, that they obey Connolly's orders. De Courcy Wheeler, again, because she's a woman, offers Markievicz a lift in his car to Richmond Barracks, where they would be held. She refuses and insisted on walking alongside Malin. You can see her here next to him with the rank and file. De Courcy Wheeler later reported at Markievicz's court-martial, she, quote, said she preferred to march with her men as she was second in command. As they walked the 3 miles to Inchicore, Malin and Markievicz debated whether they would be shot or hanged. Now, Markievicz very much wanted to die alongside her comrades. When her sentence was commuted to life imprisonment, she fell into a deep depression, from which she emerged with renewed dedication to keep the sacrifices of 1916 in the forefront of Irish people's memories and to bring about Connolly's vision of a republic. So I'd like to end with a cartoon of Markievicz's surrender at the College of Surgeons, which was drawn by Grace Gifford Plunkett, the widow of Joseph Plunkett, who she married during his imprisonment at Kilmainham, just a few hours before his execution. And this image fascinates me because Markievicz is sexualized. She's so curvy compared to the woman who is probably Rosie Hackett standing behind her. Her embrace of the pistol is sexual. You might even say phallic, especially thinking about the way that O'Phelan writes about her fascination with violence in that first biography. The drawing is made by a woman who's very sympathetic to Markievicz, but it nonetheless carries the biases that I talked about at the beginning of this lecture, biases that are at worst misogynistic and often at best dismissive about Markievicz's seriousness, her grit, physically, politically, as an historical actor in 1916. So if you'd like to learn more about Markievicz, about her political development and her life after the Rising, I encourage you to read my book, which is called Revolutionary Lives, Constance and Casimir Markievicz, and which is now out in paperback and you can buy at your favorite bookshop. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me by email. I'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions and to talk further about this fascinating and important woman in Irish history.